You have just come back from Gaza. Tell me about going to the aid sites. The biggest debate right now around Israel, and so we've met and we've spent some time in Israel together. We went to Gaza together. We didn't go to the West Bank yet together, but when over the course of the last 2 years, almost 2 years now, the first focus was the occupation of Gaza, then it was the genocide claims, now it's the starvation claims. That's the biggest claim against Israel right now. You were one of the first foreign journalists to enter Gaza and to see the distribution sites being run by the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation. Can you talk us through that?
Yeah, I think that the best summary of it in kind of one sentence is right idea, wrong location.
Okay.
I think that's kind of the issue right now, because if we look at the starvation claims in the round, they're nonsense, binary, silly accusations. Like the situation is nuanced and complicated, and to reduce it to just saying one side or the other is to blame is a very childish and biased way of approaching the problem. Look, the simple fact is, first of all, there is enough aid in Gaza for everyone. Like we know from the UN's own figures, there should have been easily enough food in Gaza to last till the end of July as a minimum. But the fact it's not reaching people means there's a distribution issue. Now, let's unpack some more statistics. If we look at the UN's own figures about how many of their convoys have been intercepted and haven't made it intact to their destination, it's at 85%. 85% of their food convoys are getting nicked by somebody, intercepted by somebody, be that Hamas, be that another militant group. It doesn't really matter. The point is, it's not getting to the people who need it. The next statistic I think that's important is that 0% of Gaza Humanitarian Foundation resupply runs have been intercepted. 100% of the aid they've taken into Gaza has made it to the distribution sites and made it into the hands of people who need it.
How have they made that happen? How has the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation managed to achieve what the UN, which has decades of experience with this sort of operation, why has a newly founded foundation managed to do this and not the United Nations?
Two things. They're delivering to a secure area that's secured by the IDF. It's effectively behind IDF front lines.
Okay.
And that is a problem that we'll go on to in a minute. And secondly, because they have armed guards front and rear, protected vehicles, and there's no way anyone can possibly get close to them.
And these armed guards are American military contractors?
Yes, American former military contractors, to be really accurate.
Okay.
We don't want to set hairs running about the United States military getting involved. Most of the guys I met were ex-Marines, ex-Army or ex-US Special Forces, so the Green Berets, as they're more commonly known. But it's easy for them to get the aid in because it's protected and because it's going to a protected area. The problem with that is that it means that Gazan civilians have to walk through Israeli front lines, through an area where there are numbers of Israeli bases stationed, down one very set route to get to the distribution site. And the issue we're seeing where people are getting injured and killed is, first of all, if they stray from that route, warning shots are there to drive them back onto the route, which clearly comes with the risk of ricochet. It comes with the risk of rounds overshooting and landing where they shouldn't or weren't intended to, and that's where people get injured. Or secondly, if they stumble across, they go off the route and they stumble across an Israeli base or similar, then you've got a very small Israeli unit potentially about to be surrounded by thousands of civilians, and they're clearly panicking and opening fire as a result. And the Israelis have said they're investigating those events where people have been shot and killed. But it's not ideal to have civilians having to walk for miles because obviously that precludes the very weakest and the very hungriest, if they are at that stage of starvation where they are low on energy. That's going to be really tricky to get many miles. And then, of course, making them run the gamut of potentially going wrong on their route in and running into the IDF. So it's really tricky. The much better idea, I think, would be to have it forward of those lines. But then, of course, it's much harder to secure the route, and then they run the risk of aid getting taken. But they can offset that with the military guards. So, the bones of a really good scheme are here. They've delivered over 100 million meals at this point. People are getting fed. Aid isn't going to Hamas, certainly not on the way in. What it needs is expanding, and what it needs is moving into areas where the civilians don't have to go quite so far through quite such dangerous terrain to get the food they need.
Tell me about the situation on the ground in terms of the Palestinian people themselves? Are Gazans actually going hungry? Are they starving? Are people dying of hunger? How much of this is true, and how much of this is Pallywood, as virulent pro-Israeli, sort of aggressively pro-Israeli accounts will discount all of this to Pallywood. And on the other hand, aggressively anti-Zionist, anti-Israeli accounts will say, oh, mass starvation, thousands of dying, tens of thousands dying, all of Gaza's hungry. What's the actual truth?
Well, there's no kind of evidence, even from the Gaza Ministry of Health, that thousands of people are dying of hunger. That's just not that's not manifested. The really important kind of distinction to make is between those who have food and those who can't get food. So if they're Hamas connected, if they're militant group connected, if they're wealthy before the war, they're probably fine. And you can see that on accounts like Imshin on X, showing people in cafes making pancakes or whatever it is. There are people who are doing just fine with no issue whatsoever. There are then the poorer people who don't have those connections, who are suddenly having to pay incredibly inflated prices in markets to try and get their hands on food and just simply can't afford it. If you go on Gazan Telegram groups, you'll see them trying to trade barter for just a kilo of flour.
Yeah.
Do you know where the food is? Where can we go to buy it? And the fact that it's been flooded with aid. Nobody should be paying for this stuff. It's not designed to be sold in markets. The fact is it's been seized and it's being sold by malign actors who are the targets of a lot of ire from Gazan civilians. They hate these people for their theft and for their leveraging of people's misery. So the truth is, some pockets, there will be people who are genuinely really hungry, cresting famine, but they're few and far between. The majority of people, I think, if they're poor and less well connected, will be hungry and they will be struggling to find food, but not starving. And then if they're of the upper echelons of that society, they're doing just fine and they're able to eat whatever they want.
Can you explain the situation on the ground? I mean, you just mentioned Gazans sitting in cafes. If you were to be, again, I have a feeling that this entire war is understood in two binaries. It's either understood in the aggressively pro-Israeli, pro-Zionist view, which is essentially the IDF can do no wrong, everything's fine in Gaza, they're just wiping out Hamas, that's it. Or the other binary is, this is the world's most horrific genocide, right? And you see these incredible images, including from, there have been a series of aid drops by Arab nations. And I believe it was a Jordanian camera, it was a Jordanian plane, there was a cameraman on board who captured this it is astounding footage of the word that comes to mind is desolation.
Yeah,
there's nothing there. You drove when you went to the aid distribution site. You drove through a part of Gaza.
Yes.
So where are the cafes? Where's the destruction? Could you kind of give us a visualization of that?
Yeah. So certain areas have been bulldozed. Literally bulldozed, because think about the tactics here. So why were they blown up in the first place? It's because they were target locations, or because they had tunnel shafts attached, or because there was an IED in the house, and the Israelis don't have time to go and defuse every IED. There's thousands of them. They'd still be trying to clear Rafah now if they tried to defuse every bomb, because if somebody's been firing at them from it, they've returned fire, as they have every legal right to do. But it leaves the buildings damaged, it leaves them dangerous, and it leaves incredibly difficult terrain to fight in. So they have just bulldozed all the damaged buildings, which, is a horrifying sight.
And you drove through this?
We did, yeah. There's not a building standing in Rafah. Not a building. It's
and
absolutely
there were people
ruined.
there?
No. So the people were only allowed into that area of Rafah to get the food, and then they had to leave again.
And where did they go?
So they go to areas north of where the Israeli front lines are, where the buildings haven't yet been bulldozed. So they're staying in tents, they're staying in damaged buildings. 20% of Gaza's buildings are fine. So obviously there are people who are in those areas who are carrying on with almost normal life, if not quite normal. Obviously there will be there'll be airstrikes threatened and that sort of thing. But they're living far better conditions than those poor people who've been pushed into tents.
And did you drive through Rafah? You walked through it? Did you stop?
Drove through. There's nowhere to stop. It's literally just a dirt road with rubble, bulldozed, twisted steel, just bulldozed to create paths and roads through the areas. It's astonishing. It is absolute devastation. I understand why. If you're trying to winkle Hamas out of every area.
Is this something you've seen in the Middle East in your time serving in the army?
I was in Afghanistan. That was my main fighting tour, and that's very different. But I've seen buildings turn to rubble by airstrikes multiple times.
But never on this scale.
No, but Afghanistan was a different war. Afghanistan was a counterinsurgency. We were trying to minimise collateral damage as a main effort. So the key difference between Afghanistan and Gaza is that Afghanistan was a counterinsurgency operation where the main effort was the prevention of collateral damage. We were doing everything we could to make sure there was no collateral damage. Gaza is far more a conventional war where the IDF is trying to take apart infrastructure. It's trying to take apart Hamas's strategic tunnel network and their fighting locations. There's no way to do that without collateral. So collateral damage in that kind of a war is a feature rather than a bug. Whereas in Afghanistan, it was only exceptionally would be certainly on the later tours would we be allowed to drop bombs that would level people's homes and houses. So it's a very, very different conflict.
Is there anything comparable to the level of destruction that you saw in Rafah in terms of infrastructure in warfare? Is there anything in recent times that comes close to this?
Yeah, in recent times you can look at Mosul, you can look at Raqqa. The big difference between Gaza and all of these wars is the fact that the civilian population in Gaza have not been allowed to evacuate by Egypt. Like, unreasonable to expect Israel to allow all of these 2 million people into Israeli territory after they just committed 7th of October. That's just not going to happen. Politically, it would be unacceptable. The only place they could have fled to was Egypt, and Egypt's response was to seal them in with a border fence that puts Israel to shame, quite frankly.
I mean, it's one of the most extraordinary borders. The videos of it are just insane. The only comparable border that I have seen was the Spanish-Moroccan border in Ceuta, which is, it's just it's quite similar actually in scope and size, and it's multiple walls and security guards patrolling it at all times. And that one got stormed. There's incredible videos of sub-Saharan migrants who make it across the Sahara, and then they conglomerate. Actually, my brother and I, many, many years ago, it's been about 10 years ago, we went looking for them. We crossed from Ceuta into Morocco proper, and then drove around looking for a group of migrants to be able to storm the border with them. We sadly didn't succeed. We got arrested before we found them. That was the end of that attempt. But there's incredible videos of these groups storming the border. That hasn't happened in Egypt. Is that because the Egyptians would simply open fire?
Yeah,
because the Spaniards wouldn't obviously open fire on a. That's just against,
Yeah, look, Egypt is not letting these people through. I mean, they've seen what happened with Jordan and Palestinian refugees. They saw what happened in Lebanon with Palestinian refugees, and the fact that both of them ended up in civil wars. Like, they've already got a destabilized Sinai with the Bedouin insurgency that they've been working very, very hard to get a handle on.
Yeah.
They're friends with Israel at the moment-ish. There's a tenuous peace treaty between Egypt and Israel. But it's not enough that they would say, hey, we'll take the Palestinians, you go deal with Hamas. That's just not going to happen. So, but the point is, Hamas on one side, Egypt on the other, stopping them evacuating, and an IDF that is trying to take apart infrastructure that has infested every single part of Gaza, every single part, every mosque, every school, every hospital, every UNRWA base. Everything has Hamas infrastructure attached to it. And so everything is destroyed. And of course, if you want to blow up a tunnel, everything above that tunnel is going to get a slice of the damage as well. So there is a reason the damage is so massive. And you can debate all day whether that's a good military strategy or not, but it's not illegal. And it's not directed at the civilian population, because if it were, we would have a huge number, more than 60,000 dead. And in terms of civilians, it's of course far below 60,000 dead because of the number of Hamas fighters that have been killed. So, again, it's shades of grey and nuance. We can discuss the strategy, but to say that it's indiscriminate, I think, is wrong.
I've seen a quote that says that no country has done as much as Israel has for civilians in enemy territory. Is that something you would agree with? Has any country done more for the civilians of a country they're fighting in than Israel?
I'm really skeptical of these kinds of comparisons. You get people saying, "Oh, it's just like Northern Ireland, so they should have used Northern Ireland tactics," or "It's just like ISIS, so they should have fought the campaign differently," or "Why didn't they fight Gaza like they fought Lebanon?" And these aren't helpful because, look, yes, Israel's done loads for Gaza civilians. They've certainly killed far fewer of them than perhaps they could have done had they were being a little bit less careful. They've definitely set, I think, a platinum standard in civilian protection in terms of lives. But on the flip side of that, they've leveled the entire place, which, isn't doing the civilians a huge favor. They're not going to thank Israel for that.
No.
So, it's this shades of grey, and we just need to look at this in the round without the hysterical narratives attached to it. Either this whole most moral army thing, which I've never liked as a thing to say about any army, because no army is moral, because they're fundamentally employed to engage in immorality, i.e. killing people. So I've never liked that phrase, and I've never used it. And then on the flip side, you've got the screeching, hysterical genocide crowd who add no value to this conversation and don't help. They don't help Gazans. They don't help anyone suffering in that war zone. It's just a useless addendum to the debate to try and debase Israel on the world stage, and doesn't really solve anything. So let's try and find this middle way where Israel's not perfect. Gazan civilians aren't perfect either, but they do. There is a moral duty, I would suggest, to make sure nobody dies of starvation when they don't have to. And obviously Hamas need to be destroyed as the other party here. So let's try and find that balance and have a sensible conversation about this rather than screeching on both sides.
It's 2025. America's debt is over $37 trillion, and the dollar just had its worst crash since 1973. That puts your savings and your family's future at risk. That's why we trust Alpha Omega Gold, a company that stands unapologetically with Israel and supports Stand Tall Israel. Visit ao.gold/stand to claim your free precious metals wayfinder guide, or call 1-855-426-4653 today. Protect your future before it's too late.